tonight's talk is about something that's very dear to my heart, and it's also very strong in my heart. Paganism. Now, when people hear the word, there's all kinds of emotional reactions to it. They think of everything from witchcraft to Satanism to the Wicker Man movie, to women, that famous line in the Wicker Man where the women are jumping naked over the fire, and Sergeant Howie says to Christopher Lee, those women are jumping naked over the fire, and he goes, of course they are. They'd be much too dangerous to jump over a fire in your clothes. And that's what people think of when they think of paganism. It's either a joke, or it's either something dead, or something barbaric, or something wild, or something, if you're a Christian or from a religion like that, something to be fearful of. The word pagan is actually a Roman term, and all it means is hillbilly or country bumpkin. That's really what it translates to. And there's a lot more worse things in this world to be called than a country bumpkin or a hillbilly. Now, paganism, for me especially, is deeply important. I'll tell you why. I mean, I grew up in this country in the 70s, late 70s, early 80s, and it was quite a bleak place in terms of, the church was still very powerful. I can remember in the Ballymun Comprehensive, our headmaster, when we did our graduation year, he was 81 or 82, the biggest thing for him was that we finally produced someone who was going to a seminary. He didn't care about anything else. That was the biggest deal for him. And that was like, I want to get out of this country. It was almost like that was the kind of the vibe that I felt. And I knew deep down inside that the Catholic Church and religion in general had not been good to Irish people. And the shadow of that has come about in the last 20 years. You cannot repress, like in the Jungian sense, you cannot repress the shadow. It will always explode to the surface as a volcano. From the time I was a kid, I was probably, even though I didn't have the word for it, I knew I was not a Christian. I knew I was definitely pagan, and I believed in something to do with nature. That's how I always felt. And it was instinctual with me. That came to a head 2 years ago. I became evangelical about it. It's just ironically to use that term, but not even child. So I'd pushed this more. I kept my personal beliefs to myself before that. Was standing on top of a septic tank in Tuam, County Galway. I made a film there, and I was standing there with two guys from the Irish Independent, Examiner, two hardcore hacks, newspaper hacks. These are guys who had seen gangland killings and would have seen fellas shot and car crashes and everything. And they were both crying. They were just crying, sobbing. And I was in a bad way over it too as well. I wasn't that bad, but I was more like, I was filled with rage because of the 800 babies inside that septic tank. I wanted to know how that came about. Those things don't happen by accident. They don't happen by osmosis. There has to be an underlying energy force or something that guides a society into a situation where something like that is allowed to happen. And this is on top of things like the Magdalene laundries. This is on top of the clerical abuses. People always forget that the 30 years of violence in North that ripped that community apart was sectarian based on both sides. I mean, I know there's political aspects to it, but that's where it was drawn. That's what we were thought with divided and conquered in the classic Roman sense, down by religion. The turned people were perfectly decent against one another. And you see that all over the world. But there was something about that day in Tuam that I said, right, I've had enough. That's the end of it. I'm just not going to hide this. I'm going to be actually quite anti-Christian and anti-Catholic and Protestant and a lot of them. I'm not picking on one fleck. Now, if you're a Catholic or Protestant or Christian, I'm not talking about you as an individual. I'm talking about how you came to be that way, and maybe you should reevaluate it. And that's all I'm saying. This is just my words out there. You take them however you want. Any way you want, you take them, okay? Now, when you ask an Irish person, what are you? I'm a Catholic or a Protestant, they'll tell you, or I'm an atheist. Some might tell you they're a Jew, some of you, some other religion. You might find Hindu people, you might find Buddhist people. But generally that's what you hear, Catholic or Protestant. And you'll say, well, why is that? And they'll just say, oh, I just am. You know, could you imagine any other aspect of your life being given to you as a birthright? Because it doesn't come in your genes. It's not genetically handed to you. It's something that you have a choice in. It's not like a skin color. So this is why I'm, I'm critical of religion, but I wouldn't, that's not the same thing as being critical of someone's skin color or their gender or their sexuality. That's completely different. They don't have a choice over those things, but they do have a choice over, once they're outside childhood, over their religion. And they just say, oh, it just is the way it is. It just is the way it is. Now, when you look into the history of Christianity, and we're going to go through the whole history of Christianity here tonight, right through what happened to our pagan ancestors, not only in Ireland, but around Europe and even in Asia. And the triumph of Christianity, all through the period right till today, paganism has always existed in forms that will be surprising to you, but when I tell you about them, you'll go, that's it. Like, for instance, the Catholic religion is practically paganism. If you take Jesus Christ out of it, you have paganism. Easter is Ostara, the pagan god of the East and of fertility, eggs, and that reproduction. Yule is Christmas. Samhain, Halloween is All Saints. It goes on and on and on. And these festivals are particular across a vast section of the world that we're also going to talk about. And my personal belief is that I want to make sure before I go that this country is never torn apart by religion ever again. Not a foreign religion from the Middle East called Christianity in its different guises. Remember, you can't even get this into people's heads. Christianity is a desert religion from the Middle East. It has nothing to do with you and your ancestors. And even for people to hear that, it shocks them. Yeah, and you have a big issue with the English being here for 800 years, but you don't have a problem with the Roman Empire being here for 2,000 years. And they never think about it that way. But that's exactly what we're dealing with. That's exactly what we're dealing with. And then suddenly people are woken up like, oh, so maybe I'm not Christian. Maybe I shouldn't baptize my children. That's like a corporate scam. Baptism and McDonald's Happy Meals are the same thing. They're the same thing. Get them young and you got them for life. Sure, the kid has to, all his friends in school, they're all making their first holiday. What am I going to do? Give them a party and don't have anything to do with the church party. Easy. That way they have to socialise and you go see their relatives and have a party. Call it a coming of age party. There's loads of ways you can do it. If the kid wants it, give it to them. The kid can make it up later on in their lives. But if the kid doesn't want it, don't force them into it. I can remember the first time I tasted the Holy Communion, it tasted like poison to me, and I'm not making that up. And I had an uncle who used to joke that I had 666 on my head if I shaved it. You'll find 666 as a joke here. But as a kid, I'd say I won't go to church. I don't bother with them. They're all a bunch of weirdos and kiddie fiddlers. He was saying that back when I was a kid. So people knew these things, but they turned a blind eye to them because of the power of the place. So tonight, I'm going to try and help you Richard Dawkins jokes about having these evangelical coming home parties for atheists based on sort of like Baptist Christian things. Well, I'm going to try and give you a pagan coming home thing tonight, just to open your mind up a little bit, just to make you think differently about your own identity. Because I tell you, when you do, your life actually gets a hell of a lot better. A hell of a lot better. You can handle it because you don't live in a cold, hard world anymore. Ireland right now is at a crossroads between a Christian society and an atheistic society. If you're an atheist, it's better than being a religious nut by any day. And I always believe that government should always be secular. There should never be any kind of religion in government. However, I've been to Scandinavia to know enough that they've lost their souls, they've lost their magic because they completely abandoned everything. That's all woo and hocus pocus to them, all of it. And I know, so in Ireland you have a lot of people who are going Satanist as well. I know people hear the word Satanist. I know a lot of people are actually practicing Satanism now. Now Satanism, or calling themselves Satanism. Satanism is not what Christians tell you is about sacrificing babies and worshipping the devil. The word Satanist only meant, up until 100 years ago, someone who doesn't go to Mass. That's all it means. That's all it meant. A Satanist was someone who didn't go to church. And that was the end of it. It's only since American Baptist evangelical Christianity came along that they turned it into devil worshippers and all this kind of thing. Satanism is like a ritualized form of atheism. It's atheism with rituals. That's all it is. They still don't believe in a god, and anything like gods and demons are symbols, which is exactly what pagans believe. And that's what we'll find out tonight as well. I don't actually believe these entities. Like no true pagan believes they're real. They're symbols. They're symbols, and this is important to remember. Now, everyone is a pagan. Everyone on this earth is a pagan. All a pagan is somebody who is basically their spiritual state or their emotional or psychological or subconscious underpinnings are attached to natural cycles. And the first things our ancient ancestors noticed was that the world was made up of natural cycles. You had seasonal cycles, you had lunar cycles, you had tidal cycles, you had menstrual cycles, menstruals. The first measurement that human ever made was the menstrual cycle. The word ma comes from that. Parameter, diameter. Ma is the root word for mother in just about every language, from everything from Micronesian to Celtic. It's the root of the word mother is ma. And ma was the menstrual cycle. It became the first unit of measurement. In fact, in my book, The Druid Code, I speculate that when they started to put people into darkened chambers, women, when they're kept away from sunlight for a while, they do not menstruate. And they're in darkness. They may have been the first effects of magic. If you put a woman in a chamber and keep her happy and alive, she doesn't have her menstrual cycle. This is incredible. So what you got to do with the sun? And this is where the paganism thing comes in. Okay, her menstrual cycle is connected to the moon, to the sun, to the tides. This is powerful stuff. And the ability to recognize this is the beginning of religion, the beginning of spirituality. Because then you develop ritual according to that. And I always express these things as circular ideas. The circle of life, the circle of nature. Or spirals. That's why circles and spirals appear on the most ancient glyphs all over the world, in cave art and rock art. Concentric circles always appear. The oldest thing that's ever been found in terms of a ritual center is a Neanderthal cave in France, where they took the stalagmites off the top of the cave and arranged them in concentric circles on the bottom of the cave. The first megalithic stone circle. This was to create a space, a magic space. Inside the circle represents a completely different reality than outside the circle. So the shaman or whatever he was steps, or she was, steps into the circle. They're in a different reality. We now have altered states of consciousness. We now have ideas of the psychology being developed. What's this? Why do I think this way? Why do I feel this way? How will I explain it? Everything from synesthesia, the idea that colours and sounds can trigger certain sensations in the body, to saying, circle, linguistics. This is the roots of paganism. Our ancestors stepping out of like the beginning of the movie, the Stanley Kubrick film 2001. You have the two proto-humanoids, the ones very true and very brilliant for its time. The ones who start eating meat develop their brains faster. We know that now. That's true because the meat eaters. I'm not putting down vegetarians or anything like that. The frontal cortex of the brain happened when we started to consume meat, and also when we started to drink milk. And we developed in about 5,500 years ago. We developed a gene that allowed us to process lactate acids in our bodies from cows. Nature wanted, gods and goddesses wanted that to happen. So you're all pagans, and your ancient ancestors derived spirituality from these magical and occult ideas. That life was more meaningful than just basic drudgery. That life was more meaningful than existence waiting to be eaten by a saber-toothed tiger. And this is powerful because this is what really began to separate us as a species, and also began the development of our frontal cortex of our brain, and also the ideas of symbols. Now a symbol, right, instead of you or you representing, proto-human 1, proto-human 2, proto-human 3, you may have a certain kind of voice. That becomes your archetype. And others will be like you to have a certain kind of voice. Others will have a certain kind of stance or how they walk. And we start to apply symbols to things. And then our development and our cognition really took off. About 10,000 years ago, and it's probably longer, because we do notice there was probably an ancient, I'm just going by the standard thing here. There probably was a previous civilization that did exist in the past that was quite destroyed somehow, but I'm just going by what we know from now on, from our immediate ancestors that we can't verify, human beings started collecting stones, and they started creating things like megaliths and stone monuments, and placing a spiritual or a psychological, remember there's a very fine line between psychology and spirituality, towards these things. And this is why we have this, I'm going to talk specifically of this megalithic arc that exists between Denmark, parts of Norway as well, through Shetland Islands, through Scotland, through England, around the west coast of Ireland and through the middle of Ireland. There's two stages, the Neolithic and the Bronze Age ones, through Cornwall, down into France, down into Iberia, all the way around into Malta and into through Sardinia. This is our ancient ancestors. The indigenous Europeans started building these megaliths. However, we don't know who these people are. They're a complete mystery, except genetically, which I'll talk about. These people, these early Europeans, we don't know a lot about them, and that's why I wrote the book Druid Code and travelled around Europe, specifically adding all kinds of things together to try to unravel a detective code to find out at least who are these people. A lot of people are still under the assumption that these monuments are built by the Celts. There's still terrible TV shows where they'll see the Druids around these stone circles. These were built thousands of years before the Druids, thousands of years before the Celtic people came along. This is how much of a mystery they are. And so you have people saying, oh, this site is dedicated to Cuchulainn. It could have been later on, it could have been adopted. Or it could, that you know, we know Owen Nagat Cave in Roscommon, which I fell down the other week, that's connected to the Morrigan. And yes, it could be, and the Christians called it the gateway to hell. But the fact that the Christians tried to, you know, besmirch it is probably a good indication that there's probably some truth to that at some level. Although there's a raven goddess is very common in all ancient ancestry on the Indo-European side. You have the Dhumavate in the Hindu Vedics, you have Bran, you have the Morrigan, the Valkyrie, and so on. The raven goddess is very powerful. And so the early, there's a stereotype that the early Europeans were matriarchal and peaceful, that women were central to their societies. Now, I would be the first one, and not for sexist reasons, to say, are you being a bit too hippie here? Are you trying to pick up women by saying this? No, but it does seem to be true. It does seem to be true. There's almost no evidence of war in these societies, mainly because there's no heavy, intense agriculture, so the ownership of land doesn't exist. The oldest figures and statues found are generally that of women. The sleeping lady, the Hypogean Hal Salvanini in Valletta National Museum in Malta is a figurine of a woman about 6,000, 5,500 years old. And she's about that size sleeping. It's beautifully rendered in a very loving and a very sweet way. And we see this everywhere. So yes, it does seem to be, you know, in spite of the kind of hippie connotations that are sometimes connected to these things, that they were matriarchal societies. There's definitely this constant emphasis on goddesses. And Ireland as well is named after a goddess, Era, the Shannon, the Boyan. It goes on and on. Mountains and hills and those kinds of features on the landscape tend to be named after men in mythology. I live in a place called Tullahushean, the son of Ushean, who was the son of Finn McCool. Tullanaglug is next hill over, Mountain of Lugh, the Hill of Lugh. So it seems to be that there was very strict gender classification, but not in a kind of a man is this, the woman is that. It was like it was venerated. You wouldn't have the men own this and all that, and women don't or whatever. It was. I'm not saying it was idealistic or paradise or anything like that, because we honestly don't know. But all the clues would suggest that early Europeans were a matriarchal society. It would suggest that, from what we know so far. So, as I said, the evidence says yeah, and the term ma is common in all proto-languages, not just Indo-European languages, for mother everywhere directly derives from the menstrual cycle. The first thing that humans noticed that was different about, that was magical, was connected to the tides, the moon, and the sun, and so on. Now, there's one country in Europe that tells that we can actually find things out about these ancient ancestors: Sardinia. Sardinia is an extremely important part of this whole mystery. But the reason is, it seems to be the only place left in Europe that has still indigenous European DNA, as well as parts of Galicia, northern Portugal, and a little bit of Ireland. But at its greatest concentration, Sardinia. Why Sardinia? Well, it's an interesting one too. I've been there, I'm going back, I'm fascinated by the place. It is covered in megaliths. They had an ancient society there called the Nuragis, and they built these thousands of these massive towers. You think Ireland has a lot of megaliths, you would not believe what Sardinia is like. It's remarkable, and especially in a country that's not particularly fertile. The entire country seems to be covered in boulders about that size. Very difficult to get cross country there. And these things are built up in the mountains and everything. Now Sardinia, DNA evidence is something that I was very skeptical of until quite recently because of contamination. We've got really good at DNA in the last few years. DNA evidence was dodgy until recent times because often it was contaminated by the actual scientists themselves or the labs themselves. In recent times it's gotten really good, and we're developing very, very good DNA maps of Europe. And one of the DNAs, they've absolutely confirmed that Sardinia is the last place in Europe that has a major block of DNA, in early European DNA. The rest is Indo-European. But that's the one place they didn't really take over, and it's a complete mystery, no one knows why. And there was invasions later on, like they had the Carthaginians and you had the Romans and so on, but for some reason, because of their culture, their nature, whatever, they are the last place on earth where you could actually say the Indo-Europeans live is in Sardinia. And what is the primary element of their sort of pagan tradition there? The bull. We will see this over and over again. Central to ancient peoples, the bull. This is why the Christians and the Jews in the Bible went after this, the golden calf, because the bull was the first god. Why was the bull the first god? Because it's close to a woman. It produces the milk, and I told you that we developed that gene that allowed us to take lactate acid from cows 5,500 years ago. The bull had and the cow had an association with the female, and the bull and the cow replaced the woman as the center of the world, as the kind of spiritual force on the planet. You get this everywhere, and even things today like bullfighting in Spain. The Boyne River is named after the Boan goddess, who was a cow. You have down in Sardinia, and it goes on and on, sacred cows in the Hindu world, which we'll talk about that in a second. But in Sardinia, they build these strange things. They call them giant's graves. That's another thing, they call the megaliths a lot around the world giant's graves. And if you look at them from above, they're a bull's head. They've got the two horns, and they're a bull's head. And so they saw the bull as a profoundly spiritual entity in the same way the Vedics in India do. And this is important. There was a group, now that was the Proto-Europeans, and the DNA evidence tells us that the only ones left are the ones in Sardinia. But we've got a bit of it here and in Galicia, but Sardinia is key, and that's why I'm going to spend more and more time going to Sardinia. I'm very interested in their folklore, their witchcraft. As well as that, I think there's a real story that hasn't been properly told there. Also, the Catholic Church, the Jesuits in Sardinia have strongly suppressed anything to do with non-Catholic religions, and there was even a bishop in, I think it was Sassari, in one of the cities in the 1950s, said that he'd given up on the Sardinians because they're more pagan than Catholic. So there's a big story there. Now, the Indo-Europeans developed in Central Asia, like Turkey, Iraq, that area. These were warlike. These guys are our ancestors. You're all, every last one of you, unless you come from Japan or somewhere, have Indo-European ancestry. These people they lived on the steppes. they were able to build chariots. These chariots allowed them to move fast. And these were tough guys. These were fighters. And one half of them went north into Europe, and one half of them went south into the Indian subcontinent. And well, they helped themselves to the women. And that's why we all have Indo-European everything today. Not just the DNA, but also the traditions. You look at the Hindu gods and goddesses, they're almost identical to the European ones. Thor is Indra, the god who cracks the cloud with a hammer and makes it rain. It goes on and on. Dumavate is the Valkyrie. It's endless. The chariot was central to them. They worshipped the chariot like a god because it allowed them it gave them tremendous mobility across vast regions. It allowed them to invade where they needed to go. Even reached even here, Cuchulainn. Cuchulainn, in the time, they talk about how his chariot of the men of Ulster had wheels moving so fast that they cut the roots of the deepest trees. That's all metaphor and allegory for the chariot destroys everything before it. The roots of the trees. This idea of the subconscious mind being changed. These are very, very powerful things. Remember, mythology, religion, spirituality, psycho are ultimately kind of like manifest versions of psychology, but ultimately bring it back to the same archetypes. These Indo-Europeans, we know from the DNA record, got everywhere. They took our women, they got to Ireland. Were they violent? Probably. They're not the ones who built Newgrange and Stonehenge. They got moved in here and took them over, and they left them to rot. They were a very different people, and there's some very good also theories that they were probably when they got to Scandinavia, they replaced the chariots for long ships, and eventually became what we call the Vikings. Eventually, they were like groups like the Gretz and stuff before that. And even the way they built their mounds and their barrows in the Bronze Age ones in Sardinia, they look like ships. And so there's often many traditions of the Indo-European thing talk of the chariot. The chariot is key. They took over everything, and they were these guys were patriarchal, no doubt about it. Although they had goddesses, the man was in charge. And you see that in India today. You look at like the great Hindu texts like the Bhagavad Gita. It's Arjuna chatting to Krishna. It's not a woman, and it's there's not where in the previous Europeans absolutely were matriarchal. Although we don't know anything about them, but we just have very good evidence that they were. Plus things that have continued through folklore and witchcraft and things like that. This is why women have tended to move towards witchcraft in Europe. And you have things like, excuse me, the Muras enchanted, that's the Iberian world, still very heavily focused. The idea of the woman as a kind of a witch, healer, the wise woman, that's never left us. And that's a direct, probably lineage right back to our very earliest European ancestry. So the past, it takes a long time to be erased. A very long time. Now, we had pagan cultures before the Abrahamic religions came from the Middle East. We had these developments out of these sort of proto-shamanic religions. They developed into what we would call the pagan religions, nearly all exclusively nature-based, nearly all exclusively seasonal and according to seasonal and climatic things, the land, the moon, the sky, whatever. And there was a relationship between the spirit and the environment. Now, you had that not just in Europe. You had groups like the Dalamites in Persia, and you had Tanghism in Turkey and Iraq. They were pagan people. They were pagans. And the common symbols you find all across them are venerations of the sun. In Ireland we have blue. The moon, often associated with women in the Greek paganism, and you had the Hellenic paganism, Hecate. Menstrual cycles often, because women's menstrual cycles are timed with the moon. The bull or the bovine, universal. The spiral, it's everywhere. And the last one, the swastika. The swastika is everywhere. Ireland is covered in ancient swastikas, and many people in Ireland don't know that. They're everywhere. There's one not far from me up in Sligo. They're everywhere. This swastika, it was a universal symbol of the sun, representing the solar wheel or the solar cycle. And as you see it, you go to India, you see Indian festivals like Holi, there are swastikas everywhere. The swastika is an extremely powerful magical symbol, just like what they call the Star of David. Why these symbols are so powerful and magical, I don't know, but they do something to the subconscious mind. They have an effect on us. There is a thing called phosphines. They're called neurological form constants, and what they are they're shapes that the brain generates without light. If you're kept in darkness for a long time, your brain starts to see shapes. And one of the things they see are crosses, spirals, and swastikas. And even the Star of David, what they call the Star of David shape. And the Jews have only used the Star of David, what they call the hexagram, since about the 1870s. It doesn't go back to King David and all that. The Kabbalistic scholars in the Pale settlement in Russia in the 1870s realized the power of this symbol as a neurological form constant and started to adopt it towards Zionism and Jewish nationalism to get out of these endless pogroms and all this endless persecution. It absolutely worked. It absolutely worked. That's why it's on the flag of Israel. And why do you think I wrote a book called Walpurgis Night about how you had a growth in paganism in Germany towards the end of the 1800s through the Folkish movement, mainly out of, ironically, the operas of Wagner, but also the literature of Nietzsche. Nietzsche was not a neo-Nazi. He was corrupted. When he died, his sister basically handed his entire body of work to these sort of like proto-neo-Nazi occultists, and that's how he became contaminated. The same thing happened with the Folkish movement, and the same thing we must always be careful that if we do a pagan revival in this country, that no kind of nationalistic or any kind of agenda tries to seize it, because that's the warning of Germany in World War II, because they tapped into the damaged Germanic folk spirit of the people following World War I, and they weaponized it. And they weaponized it with the swastika. Because when people were walking down the street after 1800 years of Christianity in Germany, and you saw that thing, well, guess what? Bang, straight into the subconscious mind, down into your lower poles of cognition, right all the way down to your DNA, and you remember what your ancestors saw 5,000 years ago. And they got you. And they got you. Symbolism is so unbelievable. That's why it's so central to magic and sorcery and folklore. And like I said, those symbols are universal, those ones I wrote down. Now, pagan just means country bumpkin. Pagan, when the Christians began in Rome, they started to call the people in the country who still practice the old religion pagans, and it literally just means country dweller, but it's done in such a way like hillbilly. The hillbillies believe this. So I've heard pagans say to me, "Oh, I never use the word pagan because it's what you call it, offensive." It's not really. It's kind of like a harmless slur. There's no malice in it really. And another one that's an archetype, and this only seems to have appeared in pagan times leading up to the Abrahamic incursion, is serpent worship. And this is interesting. It's almost like, and it's very strange, it's almost like the gods do have plans for us. They really do. And it's almost, things happened in pagan societies in Europe that made Christianity get in easier, done by themselves. And one of the things was serpent worship, or serpent veneration. And even countries that don't have snakes, like Ireland and Iceland, and a place where snakes are rare, like Norway, the serpent veneration was everywhere in ancient times, everywhere. Now you hear people say, well, the serpents represented the snakes. I don't know, maybe, I'm not going to put my, could be. I have another theory that they probably represented the round towers, which I believe were built before the Christians arrived here, and they were the worms of Crom, which I will talk about later. But anyway, that's my outlandish theory. But the serpent or reptile veneration was central to Roman paganism. It was everywhere. You go see those mosaics. You see when was taken, when they took the pumice out of Herculaneum and the suburb. What's the big one? Herculaneum and what's the other city that was covered in a volcano? Pompeii. The serpents all over the place, everywhere. It's phallic, yeah, but it's also something. It's something deeper to it, and it really, even in Ireland, we didn't have snakes there, I think a lot of those, if you go, the National Museum, you go down, you see a lot of these, what they call bishops' croziers, right? They say, oh, what's wrong to an early Irish bishop? Well, let me tell you what an early Irish bishop looked like. He looked like a bum. He was not this guy who walked around in robes going, he was like a crazy. He would have been eating insects, living in a hole in the ground, and had rags. I think those croziers belonged to the Druids. I really do. Or else they were probably pagan artifacts from maybe Britain. Why are they covered in serpents and dragons if they're Christian? And I know you do have this kind of like marketing thing where you had like these rollover periods where they have to play the game for a bit. But there's something, this is why, this is my pet peeve here. Where's the crossover period? What happened and when? This is huge. So, yeah, wisdom, but also the idea of the shedding of the skin. Renewal, that's a very pagan idea. The idea that the skin is cast off, the old thing is going away. Like I always think, some people say to me, what's my favourite pagan ritual? You know what my favourite pagan ritual is? Doing the laundry. Because I love when I take the clothes out of the dryer. I've washed away my problems from last week. You see how easy it is to be a pagan? I'm not asking you to jump naked over fires. I'm not asking you to sacrifice goats. Yeah. The smell of baking when you take it out of the oven and representing, realizing what that cake is doing, bringing love to your family. You place a spiritual dimension on a cake, and you don't need a priest shoving a Jesus cracker in your mouth. You know what I'm saying? This is the greatest crime of all, is they've robbed that magic from us, that personal magic. Now, paganism, here's another one. This always is like my Plato t-shirt, right? People talk about Plato, Socrates, Archimedes, Aristotle, as if they're honorary Christians. You know, as if these guys were pagans. These guys were not Christians at all. But they're talking, have you ever heard a university lecturer or a college professor ever say to you, you know, Plato was a pagan, Socrates was a pagan? You never told this, because they're enforcing this idea that pagans are backward and stupid. Pagans built everything we have today. In fact, when Christianity took over, we know that the cities that they built went into decline because the Christians did not take care of the sewage systems, the water systems. Who built the Roman aqueducts? Pagans. Who built the pyramids? Pagans. Who built philosophy, mathematics, architecture? Pagans. And yet we have to listen to some guy in a frock in Maynooth telling us that they're backward barbarians because a body was found in a bog in the Midlands somewhere with his throat cut. In 2011, the Irish Times ran an editorial by a priest. Sorry, I shouldn't say Irish Times here. An Irish Times ran an editorial by a priest who was complaining that there was paganism was slipping back into Irish society through St. Patrick's Day and things like that. And he didn't like it, because the pagans were barbaric, murderous people, because they found 2 or 3 bodies in a bog with their throat cut, as opposed to 800 babies in a septic tank. It's your own. Always put it right back to them without being rude. Always give it back to them. Irony is a fantastic form of sorcery. And if he had have written that about another race, the article was full of vitriol and hatred and bigotry. And if that was written about a Muslim, a Hindu, a Buddhist, or another race or skin colour, you could have them done for hate crime. Pagans, it's okay. Now, why are these bodies in the bogs? Well, we don't know. They could have been the paedophiles or rapists of their day. They just cut their throats and threw them in. We don't know. Oh, and then you have all this from the archaeology. Oh, they willingly went into the bog. They willingly had their throats to be with their water god. You know, archaeology is also a terrible enemy of paganism. It talks about ancestors. All our ancient ancestors ever did was bury people. There's nothing else but tombs. Nout, in 1958, he wrote a fantastic book about going into the chamber, going down to the end, opening it up, seeing this incredible artwork, the incredible bowl with the sun symbol on it, the mace head. No bones were found, no bodies were found. Walks out and in his thesis declares it a burial chamber for the interring of the interring of corpses during the Easter, the spring equinox. And you get this everywhere. You get this everywhere. In Sardinia, at the giant's temple at Gigantea, they have cartoons of fellas who look like Homer Simpson or Fred Flintstone. And this is how they built it. 30-ton lintels lifted 60-ton lintels lifted 30 feet off the ground and slotted into a slot by fellas who were Homer Simpson wearing an animal skin. Think always you're being lied to constantly. Why? Academic institutions were set up as Christian institutions. You could not get into Oxford or Cambridge until relatively recent unless you were a Christian. That's why they all have names like Mary Magdalene College, Christ Church College. Trinity was the same. UCG, Maynooth. UCG had a guy who I won't mention because he didn't die till he died not too long ago, who was the head of archaeology, who actually believed that anything pagan in this country was rubbish, and only when St. Patrick's arrived. And I have audio recordings of his lectures, and I'm not kidding you. And he was also he was saying things like, and then St. Patrick came along, and he was a lovely fella, and the Irish people. And this is a module course in UCD. I'm not talking about like me tonight bullshitting. A module course in UCD. He was a lovely fella, and then everybody said, let's all become Christians. Now we don't. This guy probably didn't even exist. But this is what's going on. However, in paganism, you had these gods that represented archetypes of the human behavior, the powers of the cosmos. Everything was infused with magic. Everything was infused with vitality. Rivers had meaning. Weather had meaning. Events had meaning. Pain had meaning. Suffering had meaning. And you were not being punished for any of it. It was that thing when Joseph Campbell came around in the 60s and started telling people about the hero's journey, and that the hero is this, the hero is inside you and he's got him from mythology. That's how our ancestors lived. That's why that stuff took off like that, because we're just like we were reawakened to what we really were meant to be. You had in Roman paganism, you had the idea the idea of Apollo representing order, control, and measured, good for a society. Apollo, he helps you build cities, he helps you organize things, because you can't live in chaos all the time. However, you have Dionysus. When you go on the tear, you go a bit nuts, you go a bit wild, that you represent, you're invoking the archetype of Dionysus. You don't have a shadow, you have Dionysus in you for a while, or the goddess Discordia, and then you're normal again. You don't go, oh Jesus, where's my penance? I've got to say 10 Hail Marys and 14 Our Fathers and I'll be okay. Give this paedophile a tenner and I'll in the clear. It wasn't like that. You took responsibility for your own life. And you also, when you had a challenge in your life, you were Orpheus. Beautiful, beautiful way to live. That's why paganism is better. And Greek paganism too, like the idea of Dionysius. And they used to set aside groves and places for the gods to live. Sintra in Portugal was set aside by the Romans for Cynthia, who was also Diana, the goddess of the hunt. And what do we have today? We need to do that. We need to set aside parts of our cities and our towns and our countryside for the old gods and goddesses to live. And that's our temples. Not a box with a roof on it. Our temples are the groves. Now, polytheism, the worship of many gods, like I was saying, Christianity started to go, it was almost like the doors were being opened for it. Probably because of the centralized power structures within Rome. Rome was becoming increasingly powerful, increasingly centralized. It needed a very strict order, so that filtered into religion. And so increasingly polytheism, individual gods and goddesses became less powerful, and you had super gods, and then eventually the emperor. So it was we were kind of becoming our own thing, and towards monotheism. And in Ireland, we were moving toward. We had basically one god, the Crom Cruach. The Crom Cruach was our last pagan god, and there was also great powerful veneration towards Bríd, we're saying Bridget. But ultimately, the Crom Cruach was the Mac Daddy god of Ireland before the Abrahamics came in, and they portrayed him as a giant serpent or a great worm, and they always associated with worms and serpents, the Christians. And I do believe, and evidence is growing, I'm not just the only one who knows this, is saying this now, but the pagan Romans came here and had a bigger incursion into Ireland than has been previously accepted. There's a headland called Drumnana near Lusk in County Dublin. There's a vast Roman promontory fort there. There are even very tantalising clues as an Irish Army officer who's done some great work over this over the years, that the Fomorians of Irish mythology may well be the 9th Legion of Rome, the Roman legion that vanished. They were based in the north of England, and then they were gone. They may have been a Roman invasion of Ireland, and the Irish wiped out the Roman legion, and that's why the Romans had this kind of thing with Ireland. And it also might explain why the early Christians had a hatred of Ireland and the Irish. The 9th Roman legion vanished off the face of the earth. It was last heard of in the north of England. Roman historians like Tacitus and Agricola said that Ireland was very well known to the Romans, and this is in pagan times. And as Roman coins were found, this is another weird one, Roman coins were found all around Newgrange. Now that's not to say they built it or anything, but were they here venerating our gods? And also remember, in the Irish annals they talk about the Fomorians as seafaring tax collectors. Who do you associate tax collection with? And they came from England, Roman Britain. And I believe they brought the technology that made them have the cement mortar to build the round towers. And I think the round towers are possibly, I wrote a book about it, I don't have it here tonight, called The Mysterious Round Towers of Ireland, and the Worms of Crom. Those conical tomes on the top, they were put on the Middle Ages. The original tower was a tower, and I believe it was going into the land of magic. Philip S. Callahan, an American genius scientist who was here during World War II, he built the transmission radio system for the US military, and when D-Day happened, because he was an engineer, he had nothing to do. So him and his friends based up in Northern Ireland started travelling around Ireland, and they started looking at the megaliths and the round towers. And he wrote an amazing book called The Magnetic Life of Agriculture, and he came to the conclusion that ancient megaliths, which I believe were involved in agriculture, their soil conditioning, some of them have these ability to change the soil, make it more fertile. And he said the round towers of Ireland are something similar to that. I agree completely. And the whole thing that they were built by Christians, St. Patrick the Irish Trowel, that was based entirely on the idea that Roman mortar was, and it absolutely is Roman mortar. It's lime, sand, and a bit of cow's blood as a plasticizer, and straw, and that is a Roman mixture. It's all over the Roman world. It's on the round towers. The Irish pagans. I mean, this is what the academics in Ireland are like. They don't believe the Irish had boats to get them to England. You could say to them, well, it only came with the Christians. Why? Because the early Irish wouldn't have been able to get to England. Why? Because they couldn't build big ships and go. The English records and Welsh records are full of stories of the Irish going over invading them constantly. There's a whole period of Welsh history about where the Irish were like these, were constantly invading their country. That's why Owen script is found over there. And they just went over, either stole it or brought back Romans, or the Romans came here, and it was just like today. There was international trade and movement and everything. But like we were just grunting in the muck. I mean, this is how it is, grunting in the muck until St. Patrick came along in his flowing robes, and taught us to be good Romans. So yeah, you had Mithraism in the Mithraism is a pagan Persian religion. It's again bull veneration. It was the most common religion within it's a monotheist, it's pagan, but it's monotheistic. Mithra was the god of the Roman pagan army, and he was born on December 25th. He was born to a virgin, and he was crucified and came back from the dead 3 days later. Sound familiar? And that's how you're a Christian. That's how the Roman army became Christian. Constantine came along, and he saw all these maniacs, these fellas who were like ISIS on steroids, iconoclasts, smashing, destroying everything. Who are these mad bastards? They're called Christians. You do with them in the army, and in one swoop, in order to absolve his own sins, after the great Constantine had boiled his wife alive in a bathtub, converted the Roman army to Christianity, and that's why we celebrate the gods of Mithra. And that's why we have our Christian dates the day we do. Jesus Christ probably didn't exist, or was probably, in Catherine Nixie's book, she shows that there were many, many messiahs in Palestine at that time, or Jerusalem at that time. He was one of many. And that was not actually contradictory to Jewish rabbinical law. There was a belief that you could be numerous messiahs were accepted. Eventually, in time, the right one would be found out. And remember, the first Christians were Jewish. The first Christians that came here were Jewish. They referred to the Irish as Gentiles. They celebrated the Sabbath on a Saturday, and they practiced circumcision. So these people that go on, the Celtic Christianity is the purest Christianity. They were Druids. They were like Druids, and well, they practiced Second Temple rabbinical Judaism. It's in the Irish ecclesiastical texts. They all over Europe. They were not Jewish themselves. Almost certain they converted. They converted. And the guy, the nameless man from UCG, even said that anyone in Ireland could declare himself a bishop. Anyone, I'm a bishop. And that was it. I'm a bishop. And they were. Do you remember? Anyone ever seen The Life of Brian?
Yeah.
Remember the hermit in the hole?
Yes.
That was the first Christians to Ireland, and I'm not making that up. And you also had Vala as the Slavic god. It was coming into the idea of one god right before this guy came over. Something else happened. Remember, Christianity is a death cult. It celebrates death. You worship a dead man on a stick. I don't care what anyone says that you worship. No offense, that's what you do. His death is central to your religious beliefs. That came from paganism as well. Again, there was a king called... The Romans got very neurotic towards the end of their pagan era, and they came across this kind of cult called Dismanibus. They believed that when you died, you were kind of dead and alive at the same time. You were not quite dead, not quite alive. You were kind of like an angel or a demon or a ghost of death. And you were guarded by these entities called the Manes, and this is where the thing came, Dismanibus, this cult of the dead. And the Roman pagans became obsessed with death, to the point where they put looking holes in graves, and they would just have open coffins where they could see their ancestors and they became obsessed. And this is where this was kind of like where all the art in the early Middle Ages, just not religious art in the Middle Ages, it's awful, of Christian art. Jesus is like pulled to bits and everything. They became morbid and weird on the Italian peninsula. Really dark, and they became obsessed with the idea of death. How do we get my dead sister out of the Manes and to something else, where this kind of thing, and all these kind of weird neurotic things developed around dead. And when someone died, they were considered dead, but they weren't alive. And when they died, they could not reincarnate like paganism. They couldn't reincarnate like paganism. So what's happening? Enter Christians. So what happened was the dead, when you had a pagan society and you have like still in India reincarnation, there's a belief, and also a very interesting group in the Middle East, whose names that's passed me now, will come to me, who also have a great belief in reincarnation, that you'll come back. That's just it, you come back. There was no karma thing like you have in like Hinduism now. That's a very recent thing, where you're a good person, bad person. But you did have this kind of tripartite idea of paganism, which is very interesting, where there was three aspects to you: your soul, your communal part of yourself, and a part of you that has honor. So it's very similar to the ideas you have in Hinduism regarding reincarnation and the caste system. And we had that in the Breton laws. The Breton laws was very similar to the Hindu caste system. At the bottom you have the cumhals and the mugs. They were very similar to the untouchables in the Hindu idea. So we were again, that's the Indo-European thing coming through. But there was a neuroses, and also the oracle was losing its power. You could go into a cave and talk to your dead ancestors in ancient Greece. You could go into a darkened cave, and it was probably Phosphines again, and they could see the oracles. You could see there's my dead sister, there's my dead uncle. You could talk to them. But that all stopped. There was a fear. Rome became very detached. The Christians came in and said, there's a thing called heaven. Play the game. You're in. If you don't, you're out. And that was how that's how it happened. Perfect. It was perfect. That along with Mithraism, perfect. Roman Empire, Still was so incredibly powerful. Suddenly Roman governors started converting. Here's how most people in Europe became Christian. They walked down to the temple one day. What are you doing here? Well, I'm giving a veneration to Jupiter. That's called a church now. What? That's called a church. You're a Christian. How did that happen? Oh, the Roman governor said so. He decreed that everyone in this territory is now Christian. What? That's why you're a Christian today. It was like an EU law passed from Brussels. It was passed from Rome. Why are you cutting down the sacred groves? Oh, not that bleeding Thor nonsense, do you? Well, yeah. There's a church here. How will I make sacrifices? It's different now. Instead of sacrificing money to the poor, see that guy there at the top? He's called a priest. Give him your money. He's a collection plate. And it'll be for good works in the community. Yeah, to keep him in luxury while he continues to convert more people. That's why you're a Christian. A bureaucratic switchover to kind of give a life into an empire that was falling apart. Now, as I said, the early Christians were Jews. In fact, this is another thing that's really amazing. You go ask any Jewish scholar, any Christian scholar, well, what is the point where Christianity became where was the demarcation? When did that happen? When did that happen? They all try to tell me when we were in schools when the Great Commission, when Jesus said to the 12 apostles, go this and do this in memory of me when you came back. They didn't have the crucifix for starters. The crucifix suddenly mysteriously arrived in Christianity only about 1,000 years ago. Before that there wasn't even symbols. There was a fish often, and sometimes a fish symbol was used. But the crucifix wasn't. Why did they use the crucifix? Because it was pagan and already established. Near where I live, in Crosspatrick in County Mayo, there are 2 stone crosses in the graveyard. They were built by Druids celebrating the Cronprúig. They're not Christian. The crucifix is everywhere. David, when he did his lecture here, showed that the pyro symbol was found on 5,000 years ago in a cave in Sweden. The symbol of the Vatican was found in a cave in Sweden 5,000 years ago. So they were practicing Judaism because there was no. In Judaism, you do not have graven images. You wouldn't have crosses. You wouldn't have symbols. You have nothing. You just have the word of God. And this is why this happened. This is why the crucifix was eventually adopted, because it was already everywhere. As the Celtic cross, the sun cross, and our favourite friend, the swastika. Handy symbol. They discovered the power of it. And only about the Middle Ages did it start really becoming into vogue as being used. And even before that, very rare. The idea, now where does the crucifix come from? Well, in the Irish pagan tradition, it's the Maltese cross. So you see these are called the Croix Petit, and they're the Maltese cross, you know, that shape. Like the Iron Cross in Germany. It's the Druid holding his hands out like this, and his robes dangling. And his head is 2 arms, and the part in the ground is represented under the ground, representing that the roots in the earth are as deep as the branches on the trunk above. And that's what that is. It's a symbol of the power of the roots of the earth. The roots represent things like the subconscious mind and all that kind of thing. So paganism lasted because of this mysterious period where no one knows where paganism was, where Christianity was, and where Judaism was. Paganism, I believe, flourished. Paganism did not end in the 4th century when St. Patrick came here, I can tell you. He walked into the country and he said, you're all Christians, and they went, rat. It didn't happen like that. It didn't. The Book of Ballymote from 1360, remember 1360, that's not that long ago relatively, right? Had a page in it, and the page shows, I have it in my book, The Druid Code, the page shows how to decipher the Om script and what they call the Furtek runes, which they call the Om of the Vikings. And it's written in a very paranoid style. Why? I believe that secret Druids continue to operate in Ireland up until probably the Renaissance. So we know they did officially as the File under the Gaelic Brethon laws, where they had all the powers that they had under pagan times, except they could not practice religion. They only had secular powers. And they vanished with the last of the flight of the Earls When the Earls, the last, the O'Neills and all the rest of them left Ireland to go to Europe, that's when the last of the Druids of Ireland left. And guess what happened then? Freemasonry shows up in Europe, and that's where Manly P. Hall is right. The Freemasons, and also Thomas Paine, the man who invented the term the United States of America. He wrote a fantastic history of Freemasonry, and he said that the Freemasons of Europe came directly from the Irish Druids, and that's where they went. The Freemasonry today, and that's why the oldest lodges are. That's why the Irish Lodge is the second highest lodge in the world, after I think the Scottish Rite Lodge, and they're both directly connected to paganism, Druids, and that's amazing. Now the Book of Ballymote, and then look, if paganism kept happening, so like everyone knows about the Crusades, right? The Crusades. What are the Crusades? Oh, the Church wanted to go to the Holy Land and liberate it from the Muslims and the Jews, and to give it back to the Christians, whatever, Jerusalem. That wasn't the only Crusades. That was actually a sideshow. The main Crusades were the three Swedish Crusades into pagan Eastern Europe, Karelia and Finland, Lithuania and parts of Russia. These were pagan areas that maintained fully pagan, unchristianized until about the 1400s, late 1400s, and were only taken down by the sword. The Catholic Church went to war in Prussia to bring down the pagans there. We're talking nearly 1500 years after the death of Christ. They were still fighting vast pagan armies in Europe. That's how long paganism lasted. And it lasted here in many ways too, especially in Ireland with things like folk traditions. And even then they had to give up and say, long before that they'd given up. They were like, we will never destroy these pagans, we will never take them down. Let's start just turning their sacred temples into churches. And that's what happened. And that's turned our groves into that's turned our holy wells, their sacred druid wells, into holy wells. All the holy wells in Ireland were all originally druidic, or venerating nearly always female goddesses. And that's how that happened. A big marketing corporate takeover via bureaucracy is why you're a Christian. See, if you walk away here from here tonight thinking you're a Christian, you haven't listened. You haven't listened. Yes, St. Patrick, and this character called St. Patrick. Oh, well, he came over, the shepherd boy came over, the Romans took him over, this stupid story. And he's very powerful because both Catholics and Protestants use him. And he's very powerful, and he's the second highest saint in the Orthodox Church, in the Eastern Orthodox Church. This guy is a powerful saint by any standards. And what does Patrick come from? Patrician Roman. So did he represent a crusade, a patrician's crusade in Ireland? The story of the shepherd boy and all this is very common in stories of artists like Giotto, and it comes from paganism, Roman and Greek paganism. The shepherd boy comes back and he's captured as a prisoner, he comes back later. So they adopted an archetype there. That's a lie for starters, right? Was he a person? Maybe. Was he? I think I'm more inclined to believe he was an amalgamation of various misfits that came over from Roman Britain, and were rewritten later on. Remember, we have the so-called confessions book that we have are 4 tiny fragments. Not one of them is in Ireland. There's just some are just words, 1 or 2 words that's supposed to be written by him, and they're not in Ireland, and they just said that's his confession to prove he existed. But they're written by 4 different handwriters, and they're at least a couple of 100 years after his alleged existence. The main thing that tells us he exists is a book by a guy called Jocelyn and Furness. The Lives of St. Patrick was written 700 years after he existed. He's an amalgamation. He's like a Marvel superhero of Christianity. He's an amalgamation of all these archetypes. He probably never existed as a person. He could have represented something very dark. We don't really know what took place here, but we do have hints in a lot of stories. St. Patrick went here and he killed the Druids. No, he cast down the Druids. What was the place? Down Patrick Cliffs in County Mayo, 800 feet high. Were they thrown off? And at Lough Erne, he cast down the Druid. He drowned. What happened at Croagh Patrick? He cast off the Druids. There's a 600-foot sheer cliff on one side of that. Well, he showed them off symbolically with a Roman army around them, or people, more likely Irish chieftains who can bribe with money and gold, to say, watch this. You going to do anything about it? This Christianity has never, ever, ever, ever taken over a country by peaceful means. It's always been on the backs of the British Empire. Look at North America. I was saying to Native Americans, hey, don't give me this white man came here stuff. Christians came here and did this to you. The white man had no beef with you. It was the Christians who did this. They came on the Mayflower. They tried to convert you with their regular evangelical. You said no, and then he said, oh, let's just kill them, starve them, do whatever we have to do. That's what manifest destiny was. It was manifest destiny. It's Christian language. Nowhere on this earth. There was some guy went to some remote island off India the other day, an American Christian, and this island is protected. No one's supposed to go there. It's completely protected. It's probably not farm sure language. They're not supposed to go there. And he was determined, nice American boy, and it's sad, but it's also like, he was shot with arrows the minute he stepped off the boat. And he really believed he could convert them to Christianity. This is delusional. This is why these religions that have... you see, I have a problem with Judaism because Judaism is not evangelical. Christianity and Islam is. You have jihad and crusade. That's what scares me. It's like, you can worship a horsefly named Eric. Don't try to convert me. I don't care what you believe in. Don't try to convert me. That's what makes... Christianity has a mandate to convert every person on this earth. And it has always been done by violent means. Always. And we don't know the slaughter that our ancestors may have put through. If they had 3 Swedish crusades to get to the Karelians and the Prussians, they must have something here. And I think a lot of it was based on very nasty things. Now, when the ancient Irish met the Christians, they spoke to them and said, like, well, where's this guy from the desert? You should worship him. He died on the cross and came back from the dead. And we've got loads of gods. We've got God, you don't anymore. But you've got all gods you need. You mean you worship a god that's a raven, or you worship a god that turns into this, that? No, they're just symbols. We don't actually believe these things. But they're symbols that allow us to navigate our way through forces of nature and aspects of the human consciousness. Yeah, but that's not, no, they really are. This guy from the Middle East is real. This guy from the Middle East is real. And that was the defining thing, because the Christians broke the magic inside us. And when they broke the magic, we were like children who'd been abused. They had broken the magic, and suddenly they could control us with fear. Hell, heaven, penance, sin, suffering. 10 Commandments. 10 Commandments is a monstrous document. The 10 Commandments is, the people say, I live my life according to the 10 Commandments. The 10 Commandments puts their God, saying their God's name in vain, ahead of that of murder. And that's held you a lot, because that's in the pecking order, and murder is down the order. They came about because Moses and the children of Israel, it was true, the story, reverted back to paganism. Remember, Judaism came from the worship of a god called El. He was probably Elohim, he was probably Baal, who was what? A cow. And that's why they worshipped the golden calf. And that's why Moses smashed the golden calf. They were returned to paganism. So, the Crom Cruick, there was a big political thing here in Ireland. The Crom Cruick priest, and this is actually recorded in Inishmurray Island in County Sligo, fascinating place. It's a monastic settlement, even though it's built in a circle, which is pagan. And it's got all the cursing stones and swastikas and everything there. The Celtic cross, which we know is a Christian. And the Crom Cruick priests started cursing the local chieftains who were converting their people to Christianity. This is how long the traditional magic also is. It's shown in the records that they were afraid of cursing him, because cursing is risky and it can bounce back. Anyone who knows anything about ritual magic knows that curse is the last thing you do, because it can bounce back. And so, did it bounce back and destroy them? Maybe you could say they did. But the fact that you had these are more hints of the strange grey area between how we became Christians, that were the things that punch through every so often is extreme violence to our pagan ancestors and intolerance. It's the same story that when the Christians came out of Syria, there's the opening section of Catherine Nixie's The Darkening Age is it's almost like it's true. They came out of the desert and they came into the city of Palmyra and they destroyed the Greek temples and all the literature, the iconoclast. You all heard about Hypatia and the Library of Alexandria, what they did to her. They mutilated her, raped her, beat her to death, threw her on a bonfire while she was still alive, and then destroyed every book in it in the name of Jesus Christ, the Prince of Peace. And that's like, my first two books deal with subjects of psychopathy. And there's a thing in clinical psychology called gaslighting. And gaslighting is when you're told one thing, but another is done. And the idea of that is to change your sense of reality, where you don't know what anything is anymore. What's the truth? Anyone in an abusive relationship will tell you this. They eventually say, just tell me what to do and I'll do it because I need some normality. And that's how religious crusades worked. So they would say, he is the Prince of Peace. Believe it or I'll kill you. That's gaslighting. And that's what people would say. And that's like we were abused as a people. Now there's another thing too. The Middle Ages. Did it exist? This is a strange thing I discovered in the last year. And yes, some top scholars actually question it. There's almost no evidence of the Middle Ages. The Middle Ages are a period that are supposed to when Christianity really began to triumph, and when they were finally taken over and everything. You have all the kind of ideas of Charlemagne, the great Christian king. There's no records of Charlemagne. There's almost no records of the Middle Ages at all. There's a very strong belief among certain academics that the Middle Ages were actually invented by the Vatican to pretend Europe was Christian at a time when it was still pagan. So that's where all the King Arthur and the Grail Knights and all these, the Grail Mysteries and Geoffrey of Monmouth and all this kind of stuff may have all been invented to create a backstory of a period of history that never existed. They don't exist. Go home tonight. If you don't believe me, look up the missing Middle Ages. There's some very good articles on it. And we're not talking about kooks. We're talking about academics who are saying there's nothing from the Middle Ages. Nothing. Now, the Romans were the only thing they can tell us about that period was there was a catastrophic failure. We had plagues, we had everything. Why did we have plagues? Why did we have all this stuff? Because the Christians could not take care of the Roman infrastructure. They couldn't keep the sewers going in the big cities. Remember, Rome at its height, at its pagan height, had 1.5 million citizens. Everyone had access to water and sewerage. And epidemics were rare. When the Christians took over, and all the cities of Europe all fell apart, because they were, instead of building aqueducts to bring in fresh water and sewage systems to take it out, they were building giant cathedrals. And everything in architecture on that period, they'll say, well, the Christians built the Gothic cathedrals. No, the Flying Buttress was invented by the pagans. Everything was pagan. In fact, you couldn't even do many of the things they could do. Medicine, right? The pagan Romans had doctors and medicines. You were cured when you got sick. The Christians handed you prayers. Because why? They had killed all the doctors. Then they killed all the witches, the wise women. They couldn't fix the viaducts to bring fresh water in. Why? Because they killed the pagan scholars or banished them to Persia. There's a very sad story of the last of the Greek symposiums, old Greek philosophers carrying a handful of fragments out of Athens towards Persia to try and keep some semblance of pagan classical world alive. 70% of the literature, knowledge, spirituality, art, especially art of the pagan classical world is gone. Smashed with hammers, burnt on bonfires, and replaced with Bibles from the Middle East. And that you should be angry. Why do you think all the statues in all the museums have missing arms? That was Christian iconoclasts with hammers smashing them. That's what that was. 70%. And considering what we know about Plato, Aristotle, Socrates, Archimedes, and we go, we wonder at these fellas. And yet, that's only 30%. Imagine what was lost in the other 70%. And that's it. That doesn't make you angry, nothing should. And why was that done? If you like this video and want to see more, don't forget to hit the subscribe button below, and also make sure to click on the notification bell to make sure you get all the latest videos from this channel. Thank you.